The night seemed calm over Caracas, yet something in the air felt fundamentally broken, like a regime that no longer trusted even its own shadow. A single whispered question echoed in intelligence circles across the Americas. What happens when the man who built the regime's darkest secrets becomes the one who tears it apart? That question sharpened into fear the moment US officials revealed that General Hugo Armando Carvajal, once the mastermind of Venezuelan military intelligence, had begun cooperating fully with American authorities. His testimony documents and insider intelligence did not simply expose corruption, they threatened the structural integrity of Nicolás Maduro's rule itself. Carvajal's extradition to the United States in 2023 had been viewed as a symbolic blow to Caracas, but few understood the magnitude of what he carried. A man who once operated at the core of the Chavista state now offered up the blueprints of its survival mechanisms, financing pipelines, cartel alliances, military loyalties, and the operational routes used by narco-terrorist groups intertwined with Venezuela's leadership. His disclosures struck directly at the heart of Maduro's power, not just the inner circle, but the global network of influence that had protected the regime for nearly 2 decades. He described the Tren de Aragua, the Cartel de los Soles, and the Venezuelan military hierarchy with the precision of someone who had designed every cog of the machine. Among the revelations, one detail stunned analysts in Washington: the alleged Venezuelan financing of foreign political campaigns, including those of major leaders across Latin America and Europe. This was not merely corruption, it was strategy. It suggested that Caracas had been quietly shaping political landscapes far beyond its borders, using oil money and covert channels to construct ideological alliances. Names like Lula da Silva, Nestor Kirchner, Evo Morales, and movements such as Podemos and Cinco Estrellas surfaced in the intelligence briefings, painting a picture of a hemisphere subtly influenced by a government now collapsing under the weight of its secrets. Inside the Pentagon, the disclosures triggered a reassessment of Maduro's resilience. His regime, long seen as stubborn but contained, suddenly appeared vulnerable, fractured, and infiltrated by its own former architects. If Carvajal truly possessed the documents he claimed, records of payments, secret meetings, foreign operatives, then the geopolitical consequences would extend far beyond Venezuela. It would strain alliances, disrupt diplomatic balances, and force the United States to respond decisively under President Donald Trump, whose administration now viewed the crisis as both a regional threat and a test of American strategic credibility. Meanwhile, inside Miraflores Palace, Maduro attempted to project calm. Public speeches grew louder, more defiant, yet his inner circle began to fracture. Reports surfaced of generals discreetly reaching out to foreign diplomats, seeking safe passage should the regime implode. Some military units, long loyal, long rewarded, began showing signs of indecision. A regime that had survived sanctions, protests, and economic collapse now faced something far more destabilizing: the truth spilling from one of its own. Washington watched closely, Caracas trembled, and the world asked the question that no official dared answer. If the regime's architect has turned against it, how long can the structure still stand? The first shock came from the names. The second came from the scale. When General Hugo Carvajal detailed how Venezuelan oil money had allegedly flowed into political movements across continents, analysts realized they were not simply staring at isolated corruption, they were witnessing an engineered influence model spanning 15 years. According to the intelligence he provided, the Chavista regime had quietly constructed a financial web designed to expand its ideological reach, fortify regional alliances, and insulate Caracas from international isolation. The revelation was not merely explosive, it threatened to redraw political narratives across Latin America and Europe. Countries already navigating fragile political landscapes abruptly found themselves questioning the legitimacy of past elections. Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, Honduras, Peru, Colombia each appeared in the intelligence reports as destinations for covert Venezuelan funding, linked to leaders such as Nestor Kirchner, Evo Morales, Fernando Lugo, Manuel Zelaya, Ollanta Humala, and Gustavo Petro. In Europe, movements like Podemos in Spain and the Five Star Movement in Italy reportedly benefited from similar channels. The implications were staggering. The Chavista regime had allegedly spent years building a network of political leverage designed to mirror its ideology abroad. If proven, this would represent one of the most ambitious foreign influence campaigns of the 21st century. For Washington, the timing could not have been more critical. The Western Hemisphere was already under stress, a cascade of authoritarian alignments, economic crises, migration waves, and shifting military partnerships. President Donald Trump's national security team understood that if Venezuela had established durable ideological alliances abroad, dismantling Maduro's regime would trigger unpredictable ripples. Some governments might distance themselves, others might double down in defense of shared political interests. Major media outlets across the Americas dissected the allegations, while European analysts debated what these revelations meant for internal parliamentary dynamics. Brazil in particular became a focal point. Carvajal's claim that the current Brazilian president had received Chavista funding struck directly at the heart of South America's largest democracy. Whether substantiated or not, the allegation alone carried geopolitical weight. It raised questions about Brasilia's neutrality in the Venezuelan crisis, about its diplomatic posture toward Washington, and about whether internal political forces had deeper ties to the regime now under siege. For the United States, which had long urged Brazil to adopt a firmer stance against Maduro, this revelation introduced new strategic calculations. As the intelligence spread, global markets reacted with unease. Energy analysts warned that any escalation in Venezuela, home to the world's largest proven oil reserves, could disrupt regional supply lines. European Union officials demanded clarity on whether member states had been indirectly entangled in foreign funding schemes. Diplomatic channels buzzed with urgent consultations, and major broadcasters in Berlin, Rome, Paris, and Madrid dedicated special coverage to the unfolding scandal. Meanwhile, the narrative took on an almost cinematic dimension, a former intelligence chief, once loyal to the revolution, now unraveling it thread by thread. His testimony created a rare moment of alignment between American intelligence agencies and independent investigative journalists. The story had moved beyond politics. It was now about the architecture of influence itself. The world understood one thing: if the financing networks were real, they were not merely a side story, they were a foundation stone in the Chavista geopolitical project. And with that stone now cracked open, the international order surrounding Venezuela was about to shift. The tightening of the noose around Caracas began quietly, long before the public saw warships on radar maps or reconnaissance aircraft slicing through Caribbean airspace. Inside the Pentagon, US planners had already shifted Venezuela from a chronic regional concern to an active operational priority. Carvajal's revelations did not merely expose a corrupt regime, they revealed a geopolitical engine powered by criminal networks, foreign influence, and military decay. To Washington, this was no longer a crisis to monitor, it was a threat to neutralize. And so Operation Final Circle entered its accelerated phase. The first visible sign came at sea. US destroyers moved into strategic positions flanking Venezuela's coastline, their silhouettes visible against the horizon like silent warnings. Each ship carried advanced radar long-range missiles, and boarding teams prepared for interdiction missions against cartel-affiliated vessels. They were not alone. High above the Caribbean, American surveillance aircraft, including P-8 Poseidons, began persistent patrols, sweeping for submarines, tracking military convoys, and monitoring movements around strategic bases. A nuclear-powered submarine lurked beneath the waters, its presence unannounced but unmistakably felt. And then came the unmistakable message of American resolve: the deployment of B-52 strategic bombers. The long-range aircraft capable of nuclear and precision conventional strikes signaled that Washington was prepared for every escalation path. Their arrival transformed the crisis from a regional standoff into an international flashpoint, a reminder that the United States could project overwhelming power at a moment's notice. For Maduro and his generals, the message could not have been clearer. The margin for miscalculation had evaporated. What made Operation Final Circle uniquely potent was not just military strength, it was the seamless integration of intelligence, cyber operations, and psychological warfare. CIA teams had already woven themselves into the Venezuelan landscape, operating in decentralized cells with no knowledge of one another's missions. Their autonomy was intentional. If one cell was compromised, none of the others would fall. These operatives monitored fuel depots, military communications, cartel exchanges, and even internal political movements. Their interventions, carefully timed, precisely targeted, were designed not to provoke a full-scale conflict, but to gradually erode the regime's capacity to function. Maduro attempted countermeasures, airspace closures, reinforced checkpoints, increased palace security. Yet each action betrayed his growing panic. Reports filtered out of Miraflores that internal paranoia had reached unprecedented levels. Trusted commanders were suddenly reassigned, officers were interrogated, phones were confiscated. Even senior generals avoided speaking openly, unsure of who remained loyal and who had already made contact with US intermediaries. In Washington, the pressure mounted. Congress, after reviewing intelligence on cartel operations and the regime's role in narco-trafficking, formally authorized continued military activities in the region. It was a rare moment of bipartisan unity, framed not as interventionism, but as a homeland security imperative. The logic was simple. A criminal state supplying tons of narcotics to US soil could no longer be tolerated. The Pentagon's Joint Task Force Caribbean received expanded authority, enabling more aggressive reconnaissance and strategic positioning. Meanwhile, global powers took notice. European governments issued cautious statements. Latin American neighbors held emergency consultations. Beijing and Moscow watched in silence, aware that the crisis threatened their own stakes in Venezuela's oil debt and political alignment. Caracas, once the center of a revolutionary project, now found itself encircled militarily, diplomatically, and psychologically. Operation Final Circle was not simply closing in, it was tightening with calculated precision, leaving the regime with fewer moves each passing day. Long before the world understood that Venezuela had entered the terminal stage of its crisis, a quieter war had already begun, one without front lines uniforms or declarations. It unfolded in back alleys, remote jungles, abandoned warehouses, and decaying military posts. This was the shadow war waged by CIA operatives and Marine raiders whose movements were invisible to the public, yet decisive to the fate of the regime. Their mission was not conquest, it was corrosion, undermining the pillars that kept Nicolás Maduro in power and dismantling the criminal networks woven into the CIA teams were the first to embed themselves. Operating in autonomous cells, each unit carried encrypted communications night vision gear, close quarters weaponry, and algorithms capable of intercepting military chatter in real time. These agents mapped cartel routes, tracked shipments linked to the Cartel de los Soles, and monitored the flow of money connecting corrupt officers to narco-trafficking syndicates. Their presence inside Venezuela was not improvisational, it was strategic, the result of years of intelligence groundwork now unleashed with surgical focus. Every intercepted call, every sabotage communication line, every disrupted payment chipped away at the regime's confidence. And with each success, the regime's paranoia grew. Then came the Raiders. Known for their precision and adaptability, these elite Marine units were trained for environments exactly like Venezuela, urban chaos, dense jungle terrain, and regimes fortified by criminal networks. Their insertion was fragmented by design. Some teams conducted reconnaissance along key coastal corridors. Others slipped across porous border regions, disguised as humanitarian workers or contractors. Equipped for high-altitude jumps, amphibious infiltrations, and rapid extraction, the Raiders operated under the mandate of disrupting the system from within. Reports hinted, never confirmed, that certain raids targeted safe houses, weapons caches, and clandestine cartel meeting points deep inside the country. Each operation was designed to send a message the regime could no longer protect the networks that kept it alive. Inside, the military confusion spread. Some officers loyal to Maduro suddenly found their fuel depots inoperative. Communications between bases failed without explanation. Training flights were grounded after maintenance logs mysteriously disappeared from digital archives. These disruptions were not accidents, they were signals. The CIA's cyber teams had begun implementing a pressure campaign meant to destabilize logistics without triggering total war. In military headquarters, officers whispered of sabotage. Some blamed infiltrators. Others suspected betrayal within their ranks. But the truth was simpler. Maduro's security apparatus was being outmaneuvered from angles it could neither predict nor defend. As the shadow war intensified, the regime's inner circle began fracturing. Generals discreetly contacted foreign embassies in search of guarantees. Intelligence officers deleted messages, switched phones, and avoided their own colleagues. Even senior figures in the Cartel de los Soles reportedly shifted money abroad, fearing that US operatives already possessed the evidence needed to dismantle their empire. Their fears were justified. Carvajal's files had mapped the cartel's architecture with chilling clarity. Now, American operatives were exploiting every weakness he documented. For Washington, the objective was not immediate regime collapse, it was managed pressure. A collapse too sudden could ignite chaos across the region, but sustained internal erosion combined with economic suffocation and military encirclement could force Maduro into a corner where his options shrank each day. The question now haunting intelligence rooms from Langley to Miami was simple. How long could a regime survive once its shadows had turned against it? Across the hemisphere, the confrontation unfolding inside Venezuela no longer resembled an isolated crisis. It mirrored a global pattern in which fragile states, criminal networks, and great power rivalries collided in dangerous symmetry. As Operation Final Circle advanced, analysts began drawing parallels between Caracas, Cay of Gaza, the Red Sea, and the South China Sea. Each arena revealed a world tilting toward instability, where authoritarian governments tested Western resolve, and where the United States under President Donald Trump sought to reassert strategic dominance amid competing crises. The Venezuelan standoff echoed the tension seen in Ukraine, where Russia's grinding war strained Europe's political and military cohesion. There, as in Venezuela, the question was not only about territory or sovereignty, it was about whether Western democracies could outmaneuver tightly controlled regimes willing to weaponize information energy and irregular warfare. In both theaters, intelligence played a decisive role. Leaked documents, intercepted communication, shadow networks all shaped battlefield realities long before tanks or aircraft decided the outcome. The Middle East offered another parallel. As Iranian-backed militias expanded their influence and Israel navigated its own volatile security challenges, Washington faced pressure to demonstrate that American deterrence still carried weight. The intricate dance of calibrated strikes, covert operations, and diplomatic pressure resembled the very strategy now being deployed against Maduro: weaken supply chains, degrade command structures, isolate leadership, and erode ideological support. Each conflict, though shaped by local histories, reflected the same strategic calculus: power through pressure, not occupation. And then came the Indo-Pacific. China's pursuit of maritime dominance and its deepening partnerships with resource-rich states like Venezuela created a strategic backdrop impossible to ignore. Beijing had invested billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure and debt restructuring. A destabilized Caracas risked unraveling those investments. A collapsed regime risked eliminating one of China's most loyal footholds in the Americas. As U.S. warships positioned near Venezuelan waters, Chinese military planners monitored the situation through the lens of a broader geopolitical contest, the arc of U.S. influence pressing against China's expanding global reach. These parallels were not lost on policymakers. They understood that the crisis in Venezuela was more than a regional issue. It was a test of global perceptions. If Washington faltered, adversaries would draw conclusions about American reliability. If Washington succeeded, authoritarian governments elsewhere might reconsider the durability of their own alliances and networks. The stakes extended far beyond oil fields or borders. They touched on the balance between security and freedom, and on whether democratic nations still possess the strategic clarity to confront transnational threats. Meanwhile, Latin American states walked a tightrope. Some worried that U.S. pressure on Maduro might trigger mass migration or cartel realignments. Others feared that inaction would embolden criminal states across the hemisphere. Colombia, facing its own fragile peace, monitored the crisis with unease. Argentina's new leadership viewed the revelations with vindication. Brazil, caught between ideology and realpolitik, hesitated, uncertain whether the allegations of Chavista financing might reshape its domestic political landscape or force diplomatic recalibration. The world was watching not just Venezuela, but the message Venezuela would send. Could an authoritarian regime sustained by cartels, foreign funding networks, and internal repression withstand coordinated international pressure? Or would it become another example like failing Russian offensives, Middle Eastern proxy collapses, or Indo-Pacific confrontations of how rapidly regimes can fracture when exposed to sustained strategic force? In a global landscape already stretched thin, Venezuela had become the latest mirror reflecting a deeper truth. Crises are no longer isolated. They spread, intersect, and echo, and each one challenges the same question: how far can the world bend before it breaks? As the crisis deepened, the human cost often buried beneath military briefings and geopolitical calculations began to surface in stark, painful clarity. Inside Venezuela, families whispered in darkened rooms as power outages rippled unpredictably across cities. Soldiers patrolling half-abandoned streets no longer marched with conviction. Many carried the quiet dread of men unsure whether they were defending a regime, a nation, or simply their own survival. Desertions climbed. Young conscripts slipped across borders under the cover of night. Even seasoned officers, once symbols of unwavering loyalty, now weighed their chances of escape against the collapsing authority in Caracas. Inside Miraflores Palace, fear became routine. Maduro reinforced security-closed sectors of airspace and isolated isolated himself behind layers of loyal guards. But no barricade could hide the unraveling reality the regime was losing its internal coherence. Generals approached foreign diplomats in secret seeking guarantees should the government fall. Intelligence officials deleted records, burned documents, and avoided speaking openly. The revolutionary project that once promised empowerment now resembled a fortress of suspicion where no one trusted the person beside them. For ordinary Venezuelans, the crisis did not feel like an international chess match. It felt like empty shelves, sudden disappearances, tense checkpoints, and the constant question of whether tomorrow would bring stability or chaos. Mothers waited hours for fuel. Fathers debated whether to send their families abroad. Young people scoured for work in a collapsing economy shaped not only by mismanagement, but by the criminal networks now exposed to global scrutiny. The revelations about the Cartel de los Solis, its trafficking routes, military collaboration, and alleged role in shipping narcotics abroad did not surprise many citizens. They had lived under a regime where armed groups acted with impunity, where corruption was expected, where law enforcement sometimes resembled a marketplace for power. Yet even amid suffering, hope flickered. Some viewed the US encirclement and covert operations as a potential turning point. Others feared a descent into violence. People debated whether foreign intervention could restore order or whether it would ignite a new chapter of instability. The uncertainty became its own form of psychological warfare, one fought not with weapons, but with silence, rumor, and the steady erosion of trust in every institution. Across the region, neighboring countries braced for impact. Migration agencies prepared for new waves of displacement. Diplomatic envoys met behind closed doors, uncertain whether the continent stood on the edge of renewal or turbulence. For Washington, the stakes surpassed the question of removing Maduro. The crisis had become a test of America's broader strategic credibility, its ability to balance security and freedom, deterrence and restraint, regional stability and global responsibility. Each move carried consequences not only for Caracas, but for the perception of US strength at a moment when adversaries worldwide watched closely. And so the hemisphere held its breath, a regime weakened from within, a superpower applying calibrated pressure, a population caught in the tension between hope and collapse, a continent questioning whether the fall of one government might reshape the political, economic, and strategic fabric of the entire region. As the circle tightened, one question rose above all others. What kind of future emerges when a nation's secrets are exposed and its fate becomes a battleground for global power? The crisis unfolding in Venezuela has transformed from a domestic struggle into a defining geopolitical confrontation shaped by intelligence leaks, military encirclement, and global strategic rivalry. The collapse began when General Hugo Carvajal, once the architect of Chavista intelligence, revealed secret financing networks supporting political movements across Latin America and Europe, exposing a transnational influence operation that destabilized alliances and challenged democratic processes. As these revelations spread, Washington accelerated Operation Final Circle, deploying warships, reconnaissance aircraft, strategic bombers, CIA cells, and Marine raiders to systematically weaken the regime's internal structures and criminal networks. The Venezuelan crisis mirrors broader global tensions from Ukraine to the Middle East to the South China Sea, where authoritarian governments test Western resolve and where the United States attempts to reclaim strategic dominance. Inside Venezuela, the human toll mounts: desertions, power failures, fear-driven military reshuffling, and civilians navigating daily hardship as the regime's inner circle fractures under pressure. Regional governments brace for shockwaves, uncertain whether collapse will bring renewal or instability. In the end, the battle for Venezuela is not only about Maduro's survival, it is about the balance between freedom and controlled democracy and criminal governance and America's willingness to confront threats that echo far beyond one nation's borders.